In the previous video, I showed you how to return small bits of HTML from your controller actions so that they could be rendered to your page using AJAX. Though this approach is much better than the full page request approach, it's still not the most efficient use of bandwidth. What would be even more efficient is only sending down the data that needs to be displayed and letting the browser figure out how to turn that data into usable HTML. And that's exactly what I'll show you how to do in this video. In order to begin making AJAX calls that return JSON content, you'll need to change both the server and the browser. On the server, you'll need to update your controller actions to return JSON rather than the HTML responses we've been sending. The server gets off pretty easy here because what we're really doing is moving the responsibility of generating HTML from the server to the browser, taking a load off of the server and giving the browser more to do. On the browser, you'll now need some way to transform that JSON data into HTML that you can display on your page. Since the browser-side changes are more involved, let's go ahead and tackle them first. The first thing you need to do is decide how your data will be displayed as HTML. Luckily for us, we've got an idea of how our data will look since we've already implemented it on the server. So it makes sense to start with that markup and modify it so that we can use it in the browser. To do this, open up the partial view that we created in the last video, _current price, and copy its contents. Then, paste those contents somewhere in your view, preferably near the bottom. Now, since the browser does not understand the Razor syntax, we'll need to figure out an alternative way to represent the current price and bid count fields. A good way to do that is with a simple placeholder value that we can search for and replace with the real value later on. So, select the Razor code and replace it with something like current price wrapped in a couple of brackets. Note that the actual characters I've chosen are pretty arbitrary. The one requirement we have for them is that they are unique enough for us to search for and replace later on. With that in mind, you are free to use whatever placeholder values you like. At this point, we've modified the HTML markup so that it is easy to search for and replace data within it. But if we leave it like this, it's still just normal HTML in our view that will get rendered to the user with the rest of the page, which is not what we want. To avoid that, we're going to employ a little browser trick. Wrap this chunk of HTML in a script tag. Yes, I said a script tag, and give it an ID so we can retrieve it later. Say current-price-template. Then, set the type of the script tag to application/HTML-template. The actual value of the type property is not really important. Again, it's pretty arbitrary. Just as long as it is a value that the browser is not aware of. We're taking advantage of the fact that the browser will not try to execute any script tags with types that it is not aware of. Though the browser won't execute it, the tag will still be added to the DOM so that we can retrieve it from our script. What we've just created is something called a client template, or markup that's defined in the DOM just for the purpose of generating new HTML markup on the fly. With our client template in place, let's update our existing AJAX call so that it uses our new template. We are currently receiving an HTML response from the server, but after we make our server-side changes, it will be returning JSON data instead. So let's go ahead and change what we do with that response object. First, we're going to retrieve the contents of that template that we just added. While we're at it, we'll make a copy of it using jQuery's clone method so that we can reuse this same template again. We'll also use the HTML method to get its HTML content as a string that we can manipulate. Then, we'll replace our placeholder values in the template string with the values from the JSON data that we've received from the server. We'll then save the output of this to the HTML variable that we'll use later. Note that this is a pretty simple example, so it may not be obvious now, but if you have a lot of values to replace like this, it could become quite tedious. Regardless, the template approach is very scalable and generally considered to be the preferred approach for handling these types of browser updates. When you inevitably run into the need for more complicated templates than the one I'm showing, look into one of the numerous client templating frameworks. Frameworks such as _.js or .js that handle much of that complexity for you. At this point, we've replaced what the server was doing, and we're now back to HTML that we can use to replace the current HTML on our page, just like we did before. We can even reuse the same call on line 90 that we were using before. That's all the changes we need to make in the browser. Now let's switch over to the server and update the controller action so that it returns JSON data to us instead of the HTML response it's sending now. To do this, simply find the current partial view call, and instead of using that helper method to return a partial HTML response, use the JSON helper method and pass it the object that you'd like to send to the browser. The JSON helper will take care of everything that needs to be done in order to serialize the value you've provided and send it to the browser as JSON data. With all the pieces in place, we can go ahead and try our modified JSON AJAX request out. Simply navigate to an auction and try to bid on it. Just like before, the current bid price and the number of bids will be updated. Even though the experience has not changed from the user's perspective, the browser's network monitor shows that we are now transmitting just the JSON data as opposed to the full HTML markup that we were sending before. In this video, I showed you how to return JSON data from your controller actions rather than a full HTML markup response to reduce the size of the content that you send over the wire. I also showed you how to apply the concept of client templates to make it easier to work with this raw JSON data in the browser by generating markup on the fly. Though the examples I've shown in this chapter are relatively simple, don't be fooled. The techniques they demonstrate are very powerful and can be scaled to tackle just about any AJAX scenario that you can think of.